Deep urbanism is a complex topic. It's very much about complexity as in complex system science. But in the end, deep urbanism is also extremely simple. Imagine that you're standing in front of this kiosk. There's a human being inside this kiosk. You can relate to her. You can relate to her because you're sharing values, you're sharing a language, you're sharing symbols. She is able to sell you things. There is an established manner of trading things between her and you. She is employed somewhere. In her kiosk, you can buy different kinds of things. For example, the tobacco products behind her you can buy because 1492 Christopher Columbus discovered the New World and brought back tobacco as a plant, which then also in our areas started to bring the nicotine to our bloods, which is so important for this urban operation temperature, which we need to run our cities. When you look in the front, you have chewing gum, originally mastics, produced in the Greek island of Chios and distributed over the entire Middle East at the time, mostly the Arabian countries, now also then to the West. In Japan, it's chicle. Today, we're mainly chewing on fossil fuels added with industrial sugar and flavors and so on. Also, this a kind of something which brings us up to a kind of an urban speed. But most importantly, you also see all of these journals in front of her. There is an alphabet. There's a form of communication, a highly efficient form of communication. You can read what is in these journals. The alphabet being invented 900 before Christ with the Greeks, 700 before Christ with the Romans. Then you have this German fonts, for example, in the Tagesanzeiger, invented by Gutenberg in the 15th century with the invention of printing. And most importantly, the journals are an invention of the London of the early modern age, because in the coffee houses of this very early modern city of London, the first journals were printed, and the journals were a way of distributing daily news. Daily news, of course, to emancipated, liberated citizens, which over time were able to invent modern democracy and also modern commerce. It was the start of an age of enlightenment, the start of an emancipation of the individual, and of course, the start of mass media of sorts. So this kiosk is in some ways not only a place of social interaction, it is also a place which interacts with our bodies, the tobacco, the chewing gum, and with our brains, the journals. And most importantly, it establishes a public sphere. It establishes a way of collectively dealing with each other through a particular type of technology, which is, of course, originally the journals, then it became books, then it became radio, then it became television, and now it is social media, Facebook and email and so on. And what we take from that is, of course, that the public is always something constructed. It is always something which has a technological basis. And in many ways, this technological basis also forms the particular type of public we are dealing with, which we will get into in the course of this lecture. So what you see here in this very simple kiosk, if you look at it precisely, is something like an urban device. It's urbanity in a nutshell. And that means you can look at the places the infrastructures and institutions around you, and you can decode them not only in terms of what they mean in daily life, in the way they affect your daily life on the one hand, and enable to live your daily life on the other hand, but you can also decode them as a kind of a matrix-like construct. Matrix in a sense of that the world around us is something constructed, we are constructing it, but by that, at the same time, the world around us also constructs us back. We are enabled by this world we built around us, but at the same time, we are enslaved by the world around us. Our rituals, our patterns, our behaviors, our daily lives are organized by the world we and our many, many ancestors built. This is very much what I mean by depth. A depth in terms of emergence. So all of these inventions ended up in that kiosk, and we can read that kiosk in terms of the historical emergence of all of these things becoming now the world we live in today. I would argue we then have also a vector not only of emergence, a vector of time, we also have a vector of connectedness. For example, we now are connected purely by digital means. If we were meeting in a space, we would be connected by that space. And in the end, we also have relatedness. So I'm able to communicate to you via language. I'm able to communicate to you via my brain being in resonance with your brain. And that's kind of the third moment of connectedness. So we have emergence, depth in time. We have connectedness, depth in space and network. And we have depth in cognition, which is some form of relatedness. And of course, I'm not able to present you with this choice of the blue or the red pill, but I do want to take you down this rabbit hole to some degree, with the aim of us all realizing that we are both living in the machine world and in the matrix simultaneously. But I will do that to help us understand how, on the one hand, what surrounds us has emerged, what this means for the future, and how we are positioning ourselves vis-a-vis that future. And this is an important question because we are living in a time of unprecedented change and an unprecedented speed of change. This image here from the International Space Station was seen the very first time by Yuri Gagarin in 1965, when he looked down onto a planet of around 3.5 billion people. The astronauts in the ISS are now looking down onto a planet of 8.5 people. That means in the course of one generation, the population of the Earth has more than doubled. We're living in a time of unprecedented change. When you look at this a bit more in the long time span, then you can conceptualize it like this. On the left-hand side, you have 8,000 before Christ. That's the invention of agriculture. Simultaneously, by the way, as we will see, also the invention of the city. You then have the New Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Middle Ages, the Modern Age. You have this second dashed line is the Industrial Revolution. This little hiccup in the curve is the plague. And below that, most importantly, you have a time scale. The small dots are biological generations, time scale of 25 years, me and my son. The people below, the big ones, is a kind of an oral history time scale. It's a grandfather and his grandson still able to share information physically. And with only 30 of these longer generations of 75 years apart, we are already reaching the birth of Christ. This means both biologically as well as culturally, we have extremely little experience with this huge speed of change which we are currently witnessing, this gigantic bubble we all are riding on. Now, the same view, the same can now be described in this view. So, but instead of looking along the axis of time, we are now looking at along the axis of space, where this start of urbanization, which happened around 10,000 years ago, as we will see, spread over the entire globe, connected everything with everything, sort of undoing continental drift, turning some cities into gigantic global hotspots, New York, London, Tokyo, and also generating kind of urban peripheries, but leading to a highly interconnected urban system which spans the entire planet today. The bigger the square, the more people live in the city and its agglomeration, and the redder the square, the more globalized the city is, measured by P.J. Taylor with the amount and proportion of branches of globally active consultancies. And in order to understand this vector of time and this vector of space, so to speak, it is helpful to kind of turn the time back, to sort of say, okay, this is what the world looks like today, but how did this develop? And for this, we will look at this kind of movie of the spreading of the cities around the globe, but we look at it backwards in time. So these are the 10 largest cities based on data by Tertius Chandler, 4,000 years of urban growth. These are the largest cities today. And you see how they are spread equally, more or less equally around the planet. This is the 10 largest cities in the 1950s. You see that here already the American West Coast disappeared. In 1900s, you see how other cities, like for example, Manchester and St. Petersburg, are still extremely important. Around 1800, you see that the New World, of course, does not participate in the largest cities, but you see how Japan and China are important. Of course, the Chinese empire waning, being colonized by the Western world, Japan resisting with the Meiji, in the Meiji time, with advancing technologically very, very rapidly. In the 1500s, China was still in its heyday. We have India being visible, Constantinople, the last little bit of the Roman Empire visible. 1000 after Christ, you have Cordoba, the Ottoman Empire visible. You have Angkor Wat, this hydraulic city in Thailand still existing before it is now grown over by the jungle. 100 after Christ, you have Rome, Carthago, Alexandria. Before Christ, you have Rome, Athens, Carthago, and in Egypt, Alexandria. If you then go backwards again, you have the Mesopotamian cities, Assyrian and the Sumerian cities. You have Egypt. And even before that, 3000 before Christ, this urban nucleus, this urban cluster is kind of shrinking to its origin, which is very much in Mesopotamia and Harappa, where the cradle of urbanization lies. If we then go even further back, we are maybe then going to this kind of prototypical urban nucleus, I would argue, which you see here, which is a temple. It's the Göbekli Tepe temple in southern Anatolia, being excavated here at the moment. You see these excavations unearthing these kind of round structures built probably with a lot of sweat, because some of these stones are 100 tons heavy and have been brought over many dozens kilometers from far away to this site. Klaus Schmidt, who was one of the main people responsible for it, argues that really the temple is the origin of the city, and I will tell you why in a second. And you see him here in front of one of these large stelen with which have been ornamented by pictures of hunting animals. So animals being hunted. Here, for example, a wild boar. And we have to imagine this temple as a kind of a first incubator of a narrative. So you can imagine that people entered this labyrinth on the right, they went around it, they ended up in the middle, and were then initiated probably into this grand narrative these people were telling each other, probably musing about the past, which was slowly disappearing, thinking about a future which became increasingly unpredictable, probably even because already some ecological pressures were becoming visible. Maybe animals being hunted were not quite so numerous anymore. The big megafauna, so these huge mammals of the Ice Age, were all slaughtered, they were all gone. So it became a bit more complicated to think about the future. And at that moment, people rallied together and started telling each other stories. This quote unquote machine they built to tell these stories, of course, meant that people had to cooperate. They had to stay there to operate these things. And my argument is that around this nucleus, the first infrastructure which brought people together, and the first institution, meaning narrative, which brought people together as a kind of a first moment of urbanization, was then simply scaled up, made faster, more energy intensive, more far-reaching, and also more technological by the subsequent moments of urbanization, from industrialization here, a train station, to, of course, digitalization, which is a kind of a form of urbanity meaning a kind of connectedness which allows us to work together and to think and talk together, which is now happening, of course, also in the digital realm. And all of these levels of urbanity are kind of stacked upon each other and are all working together. So while I'm on Zoom now talking to you, I still hope very much I can take at some point a plane and fly to you and talk to you also in person. Because again, we are part of the same urban system where both the digital connection is stable as well as the logistical connection for me to come to you is also stable. So that means this urban nucleus, this kind of ur cell of urbanity, and what we're doing now is in many ways the same thing, just the world we are enjoying today a lot more complex, a lot more energy intensive, a lot more connected. In the short term, more stable. In the long term, maybe more fragile. And all of it is related to these three terms which you see here, which have to do with connectedness, which is basically our ability to share interactions, our ability to share transactions, and both of them made possible by relations. What I mean by interaction is basically what we're doing right now. I interact with you. I use words, I use images, pixels on a screen, piped to you via glass fibers all the way to Norway. And for some reasons, my words generate images in your head and you can follow me and we share an experience. This is interaction, the exchange of information. Transaction, on the other hand, is all of the physical exchange of matter, which makes what we now do possible. It's me drinking a glass of water, is me sitting in this chair. It is you in your world, in your living rooms or working rooms. For example, I see the shelf of Christie Bjønness behind him, where he has organized his physical life in a way which suits him. And then relations is basically that which keeps these forms of interactions and transactions stable over the long term. So you could argue that interactions on the one hand allow us to socially differentiate. We can become complex by information complexifying. So I'm telling you something, you're listening. There are a lot of professors in the call. So at some point you will tell me something. But your discussion with me will be slightly different because you're socially differentiated. You might be an engineer, you might have a different type of experience, or you might come from a completely different field of work. So this is a social differentiation, which is of course extremely important in urban, which leads to exchange, to size, society, and the culture ultimately. On the right-hand side, we have transactions, which allows us division of work, which allow us to generate value chains, to organize markets and have an economy. And of course, in the end, allows us production on ever larger scales. And between that, with relations, we have the connectedness, we have those spaces and narratives, those infrastructures and institutions which allow us to have a complex civilization. And what's behind relations, of course, is of course their stability in the now, the fact that this Zoom link is actually running and doesn't break so easily. And because we all believe in this Zoom link, we believe in Kerstin Höger and her scheduling my talk. We believe in NTNU, who is an institution which legitimizes this interaction in a particular manner. And the students are listening in to this talk at the NTNU because they know that in a couple of years they will receive their diploma. So all of these relations are stable enough that we trust them. And our ability to trust relations is basically capital. If these relations are social relations, if these relations are relationships between people, then they are social relations. If there are relations between ideas, then there are cultural relations. And if there are relations between production flows, material flows, then there are logistical or industrial relations. And if there are relationships between abstracted value, then there are financial relations. And we are willing to trust these relations because we have been able to trust them in the past and throughout our entire life and through the lives of our parents. Because we are trusting these relations, we are able to capitalize it in ever more abstract manners. We are able to capitalize it as money, even as electronic money, and so on. And with this money again, with this trust in the future, we can then, of course, affect the now and rebuild what we are living in and working with. Now, all of this generates value, generates added value, and this added value is, of course, interesting. It enables a society or a city to draw more resources from the hinterland, to become more powerful. And therefore, it is interesting to increase this connectedness. And this we do, of course, by, on the one hand, speeding up matter on the right, for example, with industrialization, but earlier also, for example, with the trading ships of the Dutch or the roads of the Romans, or railroads, for example. This is all about speeding up matter in order to stabilize connectedness. On the left-hand side, we are speeding up information. And of course, the third thing is that we tend to turn things which are physical by virtualization into things which are pure information. So for example, money turns from gold coins to paper to e-money to Bitcoin, or speech turns to text, turns to letters, turns to emails, and turns to even more abstract forms of exchange. And this increasing reach and speed in connectedness allowed us, of course, this completely enmeshed and connected global world we live in today. But of course, the question very much is where this will end in the future. Are we able to forever increase this connectedness, or will something change at some point? And the answer is, of course, yes, something will change. We don't know how and when and how far it will change, but this is this entire sustainability discussion we are, of course, currently in. So deep urbanism for me is the discipline of the relationships, the connections and connectedness that generate a complex system of people and their material, technological, and symbolic culture acting on a territory with its specific emergent dynamics and externalities. It's basically an attempt to understand what happened so that we live the lives we live today. What does it mean for the future? And how can we understand the future and act vis-a-vis the future? For this, I think we need this idea of depth. And depth, again, in my meaning, in my understanding, is kind of based on three axes, three vectors, so to speak, on time, on relations, and on cognitive depth. And there are ways we can deal with it, for example, deep tech, deep resonance, and deep moves, which I will explain. I will explain you this first chapter in a bit of with a bit of detail, and will then speed up substantially. But I think in the end, you will have an understanding of what I mean by deep urbanism. So to start this dive, we go back to our prototypical urban cell, which is this temple in Göbekli Tepe, which you see here. I'm not sure whether you see my mouse. It's in the exact top of this fertile crescent through today's Israel, Anatolia, and then Mesopotamia. In this fertile crescent, all of the grains which we now have worldwide actually emerged from. So what were wild grains in that area in the past are now the cultivated grains which we have today. Oops. And what you have to imagine is that these early people in the temple of Göbekli Tepe, they were not only musing about the past and thinking about the future, they were also having big feasts where they were eating and drinking. And probably, according to a theory by Reichholf, a zoologist from Germany, they were also drinking the first beer. So it made sense to harvest grasses, take their seeds and ferment them, and turn this fermented grains into beer. Now, if you harvest grains and you grab these grains over many hundreds of years, then automatically you tend to have more of the grasses which have robust tops, the so-called rakis, in your collection than the not so robust grains, right? So on the left-hand side, what you see is a wild grain, a wild einkorn. On the right-hand side, you have a domesticated einkorn. And if you grab these grasses over several hundred of years, you tend to have more of the seeds of the right one in your pot than of the left one. So by grabbing it over hundreds of years, you're domesticating these weeds. And you also make them dependent on the human hand, because the right-hand grass is dispersed by the wind, that the left hand is dispersed by the wind, the right hand has to be dispersed by humans. So a biological species and humans have become entangled by these grabbing hands, but also, of course, entangled by the ritual of drinking beer and later on making bread, etc., etc. Now, this ability to half domesticated animals and half domesticated wheat was then used to make larger cities. For example, here Châtelhuyec, also in this Fertile Crescent, the city which was very, very important for Jane Jacobs. Châtelhuyec was one of these cities which was located on these early trade routes where obsidian and shells and so on were traded already over some distances. This city was uncovered and described in great and very nice detail by Ian Hodder in his book, The Leopard's Tale. It was a city where streets have not yet been invented. It was more of a kind of a cell colony rather than a differentiated organism. So this city was basically consisting of individual houses which were all entered via the roof. In today's Iran, you still see some cities like this which are still functioning and operating. It was very likely a flat hierarchy, very probably matrilinear, fairly egalitarian. But it was a place where already spatial differentiation started to happen. Individual rooms were being defined. Families started to living together in particular ways which were then traded on by cultural means to later generations. For example, where the man sits, below there, the ancestors were buried. In the far left, you have the fireplace where you could cook. You have a storage room. You have the area on the roof. And of course, in these spaces, which became differentiated, and through these differentiated rituals, also individuals became more differentiated and could start to turn into more emancipated individuals, into families which could understand themselves as being different from the family next door and so on. So a kind of a culture emerged. And with this knowledge of domesticated weeds, domesticated animals, and a conception of individual and collective space, which is being built as structures, so not found like a cave or built simply like a tent or something, but built as permanent structures. With this knowledge, probably people then wandered down south along these very large rivers and found new places to then apply this knowledge. And that, of course, is then probably the origin of the larger and more complex cities. And interestingly enough, these larger cities were always built around temples which were organization and redistribution centers very much for farming. So you went to the temple to find work. You went to the temple to get your wheat and barley. And these cities now are more socially differentiated. You have public versus private space, and you have a city wall around it. You have canals, which is irrigating this more dry area around the city. And probably these cities had a 4-kilometer wide band of green around them. And when you're standing on the top of this temple and looking out over this arid landscape beyond this green belt, you were seeing the next of these cities in the haze of the desert. So these bigger, more complex cities evolved as much as the polycentric urban system of the early Sumerians and then later Assyrian Empire. And also here, people were drinking beer through these straws. And these cities already had quite some exchange and trade happening. And probably you could then conceptualize the city as a kind of a place of exchange and differentiation, which is protected by a wall, so protected by a system boundary. Inside this wall, you have interactions, which turns into culture and social differentiation. You have transactions, which turns into economies and division of work. And over this system boundary, you control resource flows on the one hand, and you export service and goods. And of course, you also have people coming to this city, because here is where they find jobs, where they find ideas, where they can learn something, where, of course, urban culture with all its manifold wonders is slowly emerging. Now, core cities, or cities, of course, then generate trading routes. They generate supply chains from the hinterland, where obsidian is coming in and other precious things. And then, of course, it starts to make sense that along these trade routes, other cities pop up, peripheral cities pop up. And then, of course, step by step, these cities start thinking, hey, why don't we add value already to the goods which we are exporting to the core city while we are at it? And then step by step, these peripheral cities became smarter and more adept, which is a process which Jane Jacobs calls import replacement. So in the core city is producing things for the peripheral cities, complex things like pottery, also legal codes, right? Again, things and ideas. And then over time, these peripheral cities are getting smarter and smarter and are learning how to behave like a city. So they replace import with goods they're producing locally and with ideas they're producing locally. And if then over time the core city would disappear for whatever reason, then the peripheral city can take over. And probably when you now are thinking back about this movie, which we have seen in the beginning, which we were running backwards, where these cities were starting being spread out all over the planet, and in the end, kind of going back to Mesopotamia, then this relay run of urbanity probably happened exactly like that cities started, then peripheral cities were learning from the original cities. And this learning process is, of course, what then generated this urban relay, which ran over the globe and is now spanning the entire globe. And we already have stories, of course, about this relay run. We have the story here of this one arrow, which goes from places like Göbekli Tepe down to the Mesopotamian cities like Uruk and Ur, where in the temples of Ur, stories were being told about gods giving the humans the ability to harvest wheat, the ability to have domesticated animals, the ability to work with straw and generate baskets and so on, right? These were gifts by gods. Of course, we now know that they probably have been learned and developed by people over time. But of course, step by step, it was turned into a story and into a religion. There were stories about the paradise. There were stories also about Adam and Eve, etc. And probably these were the stories which then Abraham, the orange line going west, took when he, after being born in Ur, was walking all the way to the places in the west, like Jerusalem, Byblos, and so on. And then, of course, started the next kind of wave of urbanization. Of course, Abraham being a kind of a proto-historic figure, there were many others who did the same. And here we see how this idea of the spread of urbanization then also slowly starts to turn into historical record. From the Levante, so from today's Israel, the idea of urbanity, of course, then spread further on to Crete, to Knossos, where you had these 5 kingdoms organized around these palaces being probably in the beginning just simply very, very large farms and trading posts where oil was collected, wheat and barley was being collected and then traded throughout the Mediterranean Sea. It was a peaceful culture, also matriarchal culture. It was a culture where, of course, this large palaces and trading posts produced these very large buildings. Buildings were so complex, that, of course, it was the start of tales like Theseus having to slay the Minotaur in the labyrinth with the help of Ariadne. Places where, however, just goods were being stored, where a complex and interesting culture emerged, which was stable over many hundreds of years. A culture which traded through the entire Mediterranean Sea, of course, also needed a fleet for defense. And with that, needed so much wood that slowly the timber on Crete was being cut down. The forest disappeared, which led on the one hand to a kind of an ecological stress, to erosion and so on, and also to instability. And on the other hand, it also turned into the need to go straight north and import the timber they needed. Straight north was, of course, then Mycenae, the next city in our urban relay run. And all of these cities were connected by these little boats. And we see how incredibly complex this trade already was by one of these boats, which was found, this Uluburun boat. And we see here glass ingots, we see bronze, we see oil, grain, a bit of silver, bronze, of course, existing of copper and of tin coming from Afghanistan, copper coming from Cyprus. That's why the island has the name, being then turned together into bronze. So there was this really great trade happening. But then something happened. And what you see here is in Egypt, in the temple of Ramses being on the right, the big man with the bow and arrow. And on the left, you see the so-called sea people invading. So in 11,077 before Christ, around that time, something happened which shook and destroyed this flourishing bronze culture around the Mediterranean Sea, and led to only Egypt really surviving, being defended by Ramses III, who apparently did this really well. It was also a very powerful culture. And with the Phoenicians surviving because they moved sideways, so to speak, starting then places like Carthago and others. But it was a moment of collapse. The Mycenaean Greek cities had disappeared, the Hittite state collapsed, Assyria collapsed, and Egypt kind of shrank. Egypt probably survived because it has this unbelievably powerful lifeline of the Nile, bringing fertile ground to the agricultural sites every year. A moment, of course, which was predicted by the astronomers, which led to this kind of caste of priests which could predict time and could work with the culture you needed to do that. It was also a place where you had to rebuild the canals every time. So stonemasons developed, which had kind of really a lot of skills, etc., etc. So this is the kind of the story of Egypt surviving. Then the Mycenaean cities were swept away, but the Dorians came, which founded in Athens and other cities, which we know today still. Rome then came later. Rome then, of course, generating connectedness all around the Mediterranean Sea, and very much doing this by kind of militarizing urbanizations, which led to an incredibly powerful, spoiled and consuming city in the center. Rome at that time being a city of around 1 million people, being fed by an entire by the catchment area of an entire continent. And of course, it also had outposts like the Roman colony of Timgad, for example, being very typical, which was, of course, again, an infrastructure and institution which stabilized the flow of wheat from the North African breadbasket to the central city of Rome. But then Rome collapsed, of course, again. So we had a first collapse in the Bronze Age. We had then the collapse of Rome around 400 after Christ. And then probably some of the people of Rome, with the ideas they developed there, went to the swamps of the northern Adriatic Sea, basically banded together probably with some fishermen there. And then slowly, step by step, started the next city, which then again reached out into its hinterland, very much first the Adriatic Sea, and turned into what we know today as Venice. Venice also in its heyday had trade routes which were really far-reaching, where they were cutting down the forests in Dalmatia, bringing them back as timber to Venice, ramming them into the ground as piles based upon they could then erect their big buildings. But they were also trading with Constantinople and were trading all around the Mediterranean Sea, which you see here in blue, merging with other Renaissance cities, which were also involved in far-reaching trade, like the Genoese in red, where the Venetians and the Genoese were mixing trade routes. You see them in violet, how they were moving all the way around the Iberian Peninsula up to Bruges, there meeting up with the Hanseatic cities. So again, you have these cities kind of spreading up and connecting up and spawning other cities in turn. Cities like Bruges, which was the first good harbor in the North Sea. Bruges then, of course, turning again into a very successful city itself, with arts, painting, with an early form of capital and so on, which then in turn turned to Amsterdam, which was even more mixed and religiously free, therefore also being amenable to a mix of many different people, and with that inventing the modern trading colonies which gave them quite a bit of power and income. In order to stabilize this trade and to pay for the ships and to hedge against the loss of a ship, they invented both stock markets and early insurance systems. You might know about this tulip craze, where all of a sudden the trading of tulip turned into a kind of a bubble, which we still know about today. Amsterdam then turned into New Amsterdam in the new continent, the start of New York. And then we have, of course, London, even a bit further north. London at the time being actually not big and not so important, but then slowly growing quite rapidly, because they were able to insulate themselves against the reach of the Pope, inventing their own religion, the Anglican Church, with that liberating religious lands and turning them into secular lands, which was turbocharging their economy. They had the idea of fleets and navies, and the idea of capital, which they took from the Dutch, but supercharged that even more, specifically because they had some really smart people working there. Here is Isaac Newton, who you might know as the inventor of modern science, because he took Euclidean geometry and a new math together. On the one hand, turning that into modern science as being part of the kind of the movement of the Royal Society, the early one. But at the same time, he was also an alchemist. And as an alchemist, he was very much interested in gold, and therefore was for 30 years the master of the mint. And he is the person who perfected the early English currency, the English pound, to a degree as almost like the killer app Bitcoin today, to a degree that everybody was interested to have his or her gold in English pounds. And that highly perfect, highly rational currency turned into more capital, and a capital which was trusted, a capital people were willing to lend money to. That then, of course, turned into a more powerful navy on the one hand, and on the other hand, also in the ability to build large structures based on new types of machinery which was taking work which was earlier done only by people, mainly slaves, and by animals, now into work done by machines. Of course, that then being the advent of industrialization. So London was very early on in touch with India, was importing cotton, was importing textile garments also, but through this invention of industrialized work, they were able to make textile production so cheap and so effective that over time they were importing cotton from India, but then exporting again textile garments to India. And all of these reasons together, so a powerful navy, a kind of a secularized religion to some degree, a highly powerful currency, science, and industrialization together turned then, of course, into this spread of this English type of economy, and as I would argue, also a kind of an urban system, which then, of course, turned into the Commonwealth as we know it. On the French side, on the other hand, you had the French Revolution, because there the change from a feudal structure to an industrial structure was much more complicated, so it had to be done by force. And this emancipation of the people had to be done fairly brutally, but it was then, of course, becoming visible with the Declaration of Rights. And these many emancipated young men, of course, were so excited about their new prospects and about their new freedom that Napoleon could easily take them, go with them to Egypt, and invent the modern type of political colony, because earlier the Dutch and to some degree the English colonies were very much only merchant colonies, but now we have the invention of the political colony, which of course then also affected the globe in an unprecedented manner. Step by step, of course, then the new continent comes into the game, first organized by the French and the British, then, of course, becoming independent. New Amsterdam was turning into New York, Manhattan was growing. And these coastal cities were, of course, highly interested in consumption. They were interested in growth, and were reaching into the hinterland to make this growth possible. One particular spot is very important, which turned into the later day Chicago. This is Chicago in 1820. Chicago is at an interesting space location, because it is at a watershed which leads via the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, and on the other hand, via the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. So the Native Americans were interested in this place because they could carry their canoe from the Atlantic system to the Gulf of Mexico system. And therefore, it was, of course, also the ideal spot from which to colonize, so to speak, the new frontier, and to take all the resources this continent had to offer and turn them into products for this urbanized hungry coast. And Chicago was so successful as an idea that it turned in only 50 years, from 1820 to this in 1870, a highly, of course, sophisticated, extremely powerful trading spot and production spot, where grain was stored, where ships were coming through, where railroads were ending up in, where beef was being corralled, slaughtered, and then moved to the east coast, and so on. And then again, this kind of idea of urbanization also jumped to the West Coast, which could completely differently invent itself, which could become the kind of realm of the dreams, because the direct connections were in the beginning quite difficult and slow, so it could kind of develop into something new. Over time, very much, of course, also with the invention of the automobile, into an entirely new type of urbanity, where you still see the European core here with high density, and around it you see the sprawl, a sprawl which was very much engineered by the automobile and by the tire industries, because they were buying up all the streetcars and wrecking them in order for the car and the street becoming the dominant mode of urbanization. Later on then, of course, with this mode of urbanization, the Silicon Valley was developed, very much a place where the digital was something extremely interesting, because you did not have so much urban density, so you were looking for other forms of exchange, and you also had the ability and the space to do that. And all of that I'm telling you now from this very first temple over the Sumerian cities, these several collapses and rebirths of urbanity, and always this city looking for connectedness, looking for power, looking for territories and hinterlands. All of that leads to the peaks of urbanity which we have today, and of course also to these landscapes of devastation. And now we of course know that the earth is limited. We know that this system which we have unleashed around 10,000 years ago is maybe not as sustainable as we think, and we might also fear a bit that these collapses which we have seen in the past might also turn into collapses which we see in the future. So this is this temporal axis which we have been discussing. And having spread, of course, through the entire planet, we now also have a kind of an effect of the spread over time in the territory. We have cities being connected. So again, here you see the Renaissance cities, and you see the Hanse cities, and you see Bruges, Amsterdam, and London, these cities which have been fertilized, so to speak, by the Renaissance cities around the continent, but also through the continent with trade routes over land. You see how these cities grew together in a way where we now have this central axis very much being the urban, one of the important urban motors in Europe. And if you now look at Switzerland, to kind of change focus a bit, Switzerland very much is the kind of the overlap of this Alpine rim going from east to west on the one hand, and this strong urban axis going north south on the other hand. And this Alpine rim basically means we are organized, Switzerland is organized in a lot of niches, in a lot of small valleys, in a lot of differentiated places, where specifically before big roads were built, people could not meet so easily between the valleys. So you have differentiation, diversity. And then on the other hand, north-south, you have the fertilization of this very diverse, multi-chambered space, with the powers of urbanization. So Switzerland, therefore, is this highly fractured, highly complex, highly differentiated place, a kind of a nebula of urbanity, again, generated by small spaces filled with urban infrastructures and urban ideas. And if we now move in and zoom in, you have these different functional urban regions in Switzerland, which are again networked. And if we move again further in, you have the one of these regions, the metropolitan region of Zurich, where this structure over time of these little villages with this kind of old Roman city in the center grew together, first by trading routes in the countryside, then by more modern transport systems, by roads and rails, into this polycentric urban region which we have today, a region which is basically defined as a catchment area of economic activity, very much of commuters commuting into the city for work. So magenta means you have more than 12.5% of all employees have their place of commute being Zurich, which generates traffic, again, connectedness, magenta, public transport, blue car. You also see here by public transport the reachability, which means public transport itself is turning the system of Zurich into a polycentric one. It also is accompanied by a political landscape, so the city center tends to be left-leaning. Then we have a liberal yellow belt around it, and a more conservative hinterland, which, by the way, is a very typical way urban systems are structured. And if you take these infrastructural lines and you overlap them with these many nuclei, some being villages, so very few being cities already in the beginning, and then these little cells are kind of coalescing together into larger cities, like, for example, the city of Zurich. And these different places, they have the ability to grow. It's very much based on infrastructure, which is shown here in magenta. And you have the ability to change because they're not so defined yet, shown here as a lighter color. So this is a kind of an effect of infrastructure and other elements on this kind of ability of this organism to change. And then on the very right-hand side, you have what architects normally understand as urbanism. You have the buildings and the streets, the parks and the areas which constitute the city, which we experience as symbols and spaces and something we can go through with our bodies. And altogether, I would argue, this is this kind of connected system, which is ultimately the city of Zurich, but spreading out in space. And of course, we now know this has a time axis, so this developed over time, growing together and connecting up. And we now see here the spatial axis, this kind of organism which is nestled into these alpine valleys, sitting at this lake and at these trade routes and connected up by ever more powerful infrastructures, which make this place tick according to a common rhythm. So this means that cities have this connectedness, so this spatial depth, both in the small scale, here an image of the city of London, as well as in the large scale, here, of course, an image of the world. So we were looking at temporal depth, we were looking at connectedness, kind of spatial or relational depth, and now the last thing is looking at cognitive depth. Because of course, when you look at this cities we now have been seeing, be it as a Sumerian city, be it a modern city, be it a neighborhood, or being it something bigger. All of this would be simply a geographic land formation, very much like a valley or very much like an assemblage of rocks. If not, we would activate it and fill it with life, because we are thinking beings, we are embodied brains, we are acting on the city, we are making it, we are perceiving the city, we are moving through the city, and are bringing it up to life through our actions and our interactions. And our brain is a very wondrous thing. It is highly plastic. It can change. It is more complex than the brain of other animals. It has the ability for abstraction. So for example, speaking in words. So the fact that we have a symbolic culture is because our brain is good at abstraction. It is a brain which can share. It is a brain which can remember the past, but also envision the future, the so-called prospective brain. And therefore, it is something quite unique. And you can see this here with this so-called Dunbar number. The Dunbar number, invented by Robin Dunbar, a primatologist, has basically to do with the size of our modern parts of the brain, so the neocortex, so the frontal part of the brain, specifically, and the average social group size. And when you look at monkeys and apes, then this group size kind of scales very nicely. So the larger the brain, the larger the group you can build. And you need a complex brain for having complex social interactions, which you basically need in order to have large groups, because you need to understand which individual you can trust, which you should not trust. You need to know the quote-unquote gossip about the other members in the group, and that takes brain capacity. Now, if we look at our brain simply in terms of size, humans can make groups of around 150 people by biological means. And for everything else, we need technologies. So here with chimpanzees, you can make small group sizes, again, because trust needs to be generated by behavior. This behavior takes time and energy. And possibly language, as we now use it, me talking to you, is probably a really effective way of grooming, of generating trust in larger groups, even over the distance of our Zoom call. And it's something which we developed probably around 65,000 years ago, when the first group of humans moved over the Red Sea and started then spreading over the entire globe. By the way, if you look at our genetic material, it is probable that this group was not more than 500, maximum 5,000 people, which emerged in Africa and then started spreading slowly, then started, by the way, pushing other Homo species away. So Homo sapiens really started to conquer the world. And this ability to stabilize relationships over time is, of course, that's the argument, something which we not only do with the technology of language and with the institutions of rituals, but we also do it with the technology of cities. So if we now are standing in front of this object, which is on the one hand infrastructure, and on the other hand is institution, is on one hand a space, and on the other hand it is a story, then somehow already here your brain interacts with this building. It is bilaterally symmetrical. You have a frontal relationship with it. You know in your mind what it means. You can tell yourself a story. You can do this alone, but you can also do this with somebody standing next to you. So you relate to the building, the other person relates to the building, and through intersubjectivity, you kind of know what is going on in the other person's mind. And you've imagined now that in a larger group, a congregation going in, talking to a priest, listening to a priest, and you imagine that over a longer time span, your grandfather having been in this church and your own grandson or granddaughter being baptized in this church, then you start realizing how this object and how this story around the object starts stabilizing this group of Homo sapiens in space and time to a sufficient degree that they can socially differentiate with this stability. They can start to divide work, and with that they can generate complexity. With that complexity they can add value. With that add value they can become more powerful. With that power they can draw resources and people and idea into the cities, and with that they can of course conquer territory and grow from a small city into a much bigger one. And again, this has been spread by technology, by the invention of writing, by writing becoming abstract and yet powerful enough that the Pope could have a presence over a large distance, that I can talk to you via Zoom, but already Alexander Graham Bell could have talked to you via telephone, and by digital means, we can span the entire globe. And by Facebook, we can do even more of that. But even in Facebook, by the way, you still have around 150 true friends. So people you know what their actual relation status is like, people you have kind of, some gossip about. And all the other friends you might have on Facebook are actually friends which are more artificial and in that sense, quote unquote, more urban. And that again, altogether means, again, the public sphere is something which is constructed. So not only the medium is the message, but also the medium is the public sphere. That then of course brings us back to the matrix, where the architect is very much a copy, of course, of Marshall McLuhan. And all of these abilities, the ability to emerge, so temporal depth, the ability to connect, so spatial depth, the ability to do that in a stable way by means of communication, which is based on our cognitive depth, that of course leads to a planet with these gigantic leaps, these gigantic peaks of urbanization, which we witness today. And this is maybe, as we have seen, not quite as stable as we would want to. So we have seen already two large collapses. We have seen the collapse of the Bronze Age. We have seen the collapse of Rome. And we have seen the changes which happened throughout history. And a person who is an expert in thinking about these collapses, about bubbles that burst, is Didier Sonnet. He, for example, predicted the burst of the financial bubble in 2008 with his graphs here. It basically has to do with looking at change in time and realizing that this change is actually not based on an exponential growth, but it is a super exponential growth. So it is faster than exponential. And this means at some point in finite time, a vertical line is being reached. This vertical line he calls a singularity. And this singularity basically means something will change when the mathematics on the one hand, or for example, a rise in value in finance, on the other hand, is reaching that vertical line. And he now has looked at population growth. So again, the same graph you have seen at the very beginning on the one hand, and he has looked at economic growth on the other hand, and can show that also here, you know, with ups and downs and with already smaller collapses in the past and things which are happening and so on, but somehow with this overall super exponential growth, we are looking again at a sort of regime change, at a kind of a quote unquote singularity at around 2050. When you look at economic data, so Standard & Poor's, Dow Jones, et cetera, you have a similar type of super exponential growth, which we now feel very much in the overcharged kind of stock markets, which currently are happening, where again, this will shoot up, and also here in around 2050 will come to a kind of a crunching point. Now, what does this crunching point mean, and why is it so problematic? And here we need to understand the idea of bifurcation. Bifurcation basically means something happens which cannot be undone. And an example of this is this famous frog in the hot water. When you look at the graph on the left, you have conditions on the x-axis, ecosystem state on the y-axis, and you have a very simple relationship. If you put stress onto the ecosystem, then the ecosystem gets worse and worse and worse, but you can easily undo that. So the frog gets hotter and hotter, but if the water cools down, your frog is still happy and alive. If you stress it harder, then going up that curve becomes a bit more difficult, but something happens when you boil the frog too much. At some point it dies, and after the frog having died, you cannot re-awake the frog to life, however quickly you cool the water. Meaning you cannot go back to the state before the bifurcation. You cannot go back to a state before the system change. Barnowski showed that also with land use. So in dark green, you have the amount of land which is affected by humans since the 17th century, what he calls global forcing. And also he thinks that around 2045, something might happen, which basically brings the planet into a state beyond a regime change, beyond a singularity, or beyond the bifurcation, from which we cannot recover quite so easily. Rockström, you might all know that, from being your Swedish neighbor with Resilience Institute at Stockholm University, shows that in his paper with in Nature paper with the planetary boundaries, that also here you have a couple of effects which we have on the planet, where the safe zone in green is largely superseded, for example, in terms of biodiversity loss, nitrogen cycle, and other things, climate change being only one of many stresses we put onto this planet. And people like Jared Diamond tells us that, you know, collapses are a historical fact. They happen, and they are always based on very similar factors, he says, namely on ecological degradation, on climate change, on hostile neighbors, of decreasing support by friendly neighbors, and a well-made or not so well-made societal response. And of course, in his historical cases, these were always local phenomena. Now we have the same thing on a global scale. This is all a bit scary. So for me, a very important person as a kind of a remedy to that is C.S. Holling, a systems ecologist. And C.S. Holling basically shows us a very similar graph. Here you have connectedness and value, or potential, or ecosystem state, you call it, on the left-hand y-axis. And he says, well, look, this type of building up of value and connectedness over time, and then being at a peak, collapsing, releasing, and reorganization. This is actually fairly normal. This happens all the time. It happens in a rainforest, where a forest grows. It's really strong, powerful, all the biomass is in the trees. Then maybe a tipping point happens. All of the nutrients are released into the environment. They are then reorganized, etc. It might also happen with a company which is successful and operating well. Then an economic climate changes, and the industry is maybe falling apart. It's going bankrupt, but the industrial buildings are being reorganized. There are temporary uses in it, and so on and so on. He says this is actually fairly normal, and these kind of what he calls adaptive cycles, they happen in scales of time and in scales of place in many different ways, and are kind of nested into each other. And the argument is that probably it would be smart to not always try so hard to push risk into the future for the sake of a temporary stability, but rather understand that we need many small systems which are having their own little cycles, and only for the most important thing we are looking at the kind of the bigger cycle. So he's describing a kind of a ecological system which is based on this idea of nestedness, and you could also describe it as a federalized or confederate system, which is very much like Switzerland, which you could think about that. But for sure, the argument would be that a highly interconnected global system is maybe not the most sustainable and resilient thing we can think of. I will now become a lot faster and will jump about some things because I realize the lecture is long. The industrial city is very much the idea on looking beyond this bifurcation, this singularity, a potential readjustment of the global system into the future, and kind of imagine how a city could be still technological and industrialized, but also industrious, so working together in a good way, but maybe be based on more local circular material flows rather than on this super globalized system which we have today. Digitalization is hereby helpful, and we are looking at Swiss cities and Switzerland in general in terms, again, how it has emerged, how it is connected, how we think about it, and how it could exist in the future, with the industry being invented far away from the cities in the countryside, in these small places, having led to new towns like this kind of watchmaking town of La Chaux-de-Fonds, having then moved closer to the urban centers with the invention of rail on the one hand and electricity on the other hand, and of course now being involved in this kind of headquarters of very globalized economies, happening still very much in cities in Switzerland, where these red parts are places where urban production is still happening. But another thing which is of course important is not only the understanding of technology in cities, and an idea of how we can maybe make these high-tech cities again more circular, a bit more local, more regional, to insulate us from a bit too much global instability. But it also has to do with working with and talking to people in a new way. For example, by good forms of participation. Here, us working on a kind of an urban area in Zurich. Or also inventing digital tools to enable these more local collaborations, also seeing how people actually use cities. So here, for example, a person in the city with magenta, him being at home, respectively in the office, cyan, him being walking around, and orange, him using public transport. That then leading to a kind of a new way of, a new analytical way of understanding cities a bit better. And finally, of course, it is very much important also to think ahead. So here in Venice, we tried to think with people we invited about the next 100 years in a kind of an idea of scenarios for an Alpine city-state. So if we were starting Switzerland today, what would its constitution need to be like? So we made a kind of a constitutional assembly, projecting our society into the future, but making it a bit more future-proof also. Here, the cultural minister of Switzerland opening this salon, which we did. Lots of people coming to this first constitutional assembly, so to speak, is also very much the content of the book, which Kerstin has been mentioning. And most importantly, I think we also need to generate stories which go beyond this event horizon, which go beyond this future, which we cannot quite understand, in order to generate narratives also after a possible change, after a possible readjustment of the global system. And no person could do this better than the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, who did this for Mars, wrote a very nice contribution to our book in a discussion with me, wrote a wonderful book in which we are also credited about New York after climate change, where New York turns into a kind of a Venice of the future, still a place where people can lead interesting lives, where life is exciting and novel and full of ideas. And in his latest book, The Ministry for the Future, he actually placed a new ministry, a ministry which is dealing with the implementation of the Paris Climate Accord into Zurich, a city which he kind of rediscovered through us, but also likes because he and his wife actually lived there in the 80s. But a city which he thinks embedded in a kind of a federalized society, in a kind of a nested system, still industrialized, as a place where he thinks this ministry would actually kind of work well. And this is the story of deep urbanism. I hope it was not too long. Again, we went through the three dimensions: the dimension of space, how did everything emerge? The time, how did everything emerge? The dimension of space, how is everything connected? Then the dimension of cognition, what does this have to do with us as being this super specific species with a really large brain, and a need for being together and a need for interaction and safety. And the bottleneck that is generating by the fact that this system, which we invented 10,000 years ago, it has now grown into something which spans the entire planet. And I tried to very quickly show how we should think beyond this impasse in a future which is still in some ways technologically enabled, because only then we can live something like the lives which we have today. A future where we are better thinking about us as a system which we are generating collectively and which we are depending on collectively. So I'm looking for a kind of a second enlightenment, an enlightenment not on the emancipation of the individual, but of the realization that we are a collective and are interacting in many complex ways. And most importantly, I'm arguing it should be a future where we still kind of like each other and have a belief in beauty.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think it became very clear, your theory. It helped. I think it helped that you also showed how our cities evolved and how the connections changed, or the connectedness changed over time from the first cities, industrialization to today. I have tons of questions. I have a question regarding the change of the quality of the connections today. Is it just like the size, the speed, the complexity, or is there actually like what changed in the relations, and I think in the transactions? Yeah, so there I have many questions, and then.
But maybe I can just quickly answer, because
yeah,
I think very much the idea of what I'm trying to tell you is that, you know, we are still the same primates with a big brain. We are still the same people as in Göbekli Tepe, thinking about the past and trying to envision a future together, surrounded by this incubator which we built, telling each other stories and enjoying spaces, eating a meal and drinking beer. We're still the exact same creatures, right? It's the exact same things. It just became more technological. That means faster, more virtual, more energy consuming, bigger in reach. And but for me, this story and going back to the origin is a way of trying to understanding and disentangling this extremely complex world we live in today. You know, if you look at a city and the urban system today, you're overwhelmed by complexity. Like, what the hell should I do? This is completely unmanageable, right? And it's completely non-understandable. But if you understand that all of this goes back to a couple of very simple things, then all of a sudden this gives you mental access, right? It's like looking at nature and understanding Darwin and understanding that there was a first cell. And with that, you can untangle, and establish a science of it, etc., etc., etc. I think that will be the dream, you know, that we have mental access to the system which we created and the system we are living in and the system which unfortunately is our future, which will be a difficult one. So.
But you explained well that we, for example, we only can have these really close relationships with around 150 people. So, and that probably didn't change so much since the first inhabitants of these cities, 10,000 BC. So that is my question. Is it just this acceleration? And then, but then the next one is then for sure the collapse. I mean, maybe the pandemic is already this disruption, right? But for sure, you showed here with these theoreticians on how the money, right? The money curve, the money thing is crashing. So now he also expects that the growth, the population growth, will stop. So I think we can talk, but maybe before we do that, because that is an open-ended question, maybe we can also, and actually you can all, whoever, you can all turn on your cameras for the discussion. You can also put questions in the chat, but yeah, that's so we have here one question from Peter Nordbröden. So do you think we need a change in societal values? exclusively prioritize this accelerated unsustainable growth. That's related to my question. So
this is really the question. I mean, it's the question, right? And what I have been trying to show is that growth is inherent in the system we invented, right? It's an almost physical constant. It's almost physics, right? So a city which turns complex is more powerful, and because it's more powerful, it can gather more things and more people and more ideas, which in turn makes it more complex, which makes it more powerful, right? This is in science, this is called a system of proportional growth. It's called proportional growth, right? And this is inherent, probably already inherent in our brain, that we try to connect things and stabilize things in the future, try to gain power and attention, etc., etc. And very much has to do also with human traits which we like, with our ability to relate, with our ability to be kind, with our ability to protect. Now, what we know from history is that again, there is this inherent drive to growth, this inherent drive to inequality also, by the way. And those civilizations, societies, and people had longer moments of stability, which were able to better redistribute, which were able to better counteract this inherent drive to growth. And counteracting is, on the one hand, based on of course morals, right? But it's on the other hand also based on material constraints. So, for example, the cooperative movements were very much an idea also of these alpine societies in moments when, of course, the winters were hard, the winters were long, and you simply had to band together, right? The Egyptian kingdom basically was restarted 3 times. There was always blossoming, collapse, blossoming, collapse. And the restart was always accompanied by a new religion, by a new form of thinking about God. It became increasingly more monotheistic, right? So the learning from the past is that, yes, systems are inherently unstable. Therefore, we need to learn how to make them more stable. If nature forces us to be more stable, like in long alpine winters, or in Scandinavia by the brutality of having not so much sun, by being far north, by having lots of snow and so on, then you start to behave more cleverly collectively, right? And unfortunately, by technological means, we have been able to so much move away from these material constraints that the punishment of our misbehavior is too far in the future, right? We are not punished by the next winter. We are punished by a winter 20 years from now. And then our system, our cultural systems to deal with this material bottlenecks don't function anymore. And for this, we need, again, this kind of second enlightenment. We need to understand that the market alone, culture alone, society alone is inherently unstable. So we need to voluntarily, by political will, act on it and enforce certain constraints, because we know what the future will bring otherwise. How to do that, I have no idea. How can you muster the political will and the scientific foresight and the coherent enough idea about who we really are in order to generate that ability to artificially constrain us, I think this is incredibly hard. And in that sense, of course, COVID was very much a window into the future. You know, COVID is a kind of a phenomenon of a highly interconnected world, and all instabilities which we are experiencing already and which we will experience in the future are also phenomena of a highly interconnected world. And in many ways, COVID was a window into the future and a kind of a testing ground. How would we react as nations, as societies, as a globe to this, spreading instability in an abstract sense.
But I think COVID showed that is actually also the acceleration of even more connections, connectedness and collaboration. Now I think it's the first time the whole world is collaborating together and not competing and fighting each other to survive. No? Yeah. And for sure we have these limited resources and earth, but for sure still now there is no, for sure we have all the younger generation, right? We are all conscious, and I think we develop the resonance in as you said, maybe in some countries like here, like in Norway or in the Nordic countries, where you have these for example, the hard winters. You care. But for sure, I could also imagine that it seems throughout this history of 10,000 years, there was always this innovation and adaptation. That it became these connections, our cities, everything became denser. For sure, we know the limits, but it could also be that. So maybe the question would maybe, I'm sure there you have sources too. If someone made this science fiction scenario, like could we actually double? Right? Well, what happens if this is not a curve? It's like a peak, right? How much can this go up?
This is actually a good point, the role of innovation. I mean, the invention of agriculture was an innovation at a time where ecological pressures already were felt. My personal hypothesis, right? I'm not sure whether we can prove that. And the rate of innovation increased over the course of history. Geoffrey West, in his book called Scales or Scaling, is showing this quite nicely. And innovation was always the way out of an impasse. So you had the impasse of food, so you invented agriculture. Then you had the impasse of water, then you invented canal systems. Then you had the impasse of goods you had to import, then you invented boats to trade, et cetera, et cetera. So innovation was always the way out of an impasse. But with that, of course, we turned short-term local risks into long-term global risks, right? Because we were pushing the risk, we were externalizing the risk beyond the system boundary in space and beyond the system boundary in time, right? And in some ways, we are inheriting now all of this delayed risk. Our generation is now inheriting in some ways, right? But again, I think these are. I think the point is also many students might think now. So why the hell is he telling us that? It sounds a bit bleak, and it's also way too complicated. Like, what the hell is this Swiss guy talking about? I think there are two things which are important for me. Point number one is I want to give you a sense of this depth. I want to give you a sense of not these superficial discussions which we have now today about trends, about innovation, about smart cities, etc. Nothing of that is truly new, in a sense that it just repeats things in a very good and positive way, which our ancestors already had to deal with, right? This is so depth means you have to have an understanding that everything has emerged over time, and nothing is in that sense fundamentally new, but all of it is an expression of our existence as embodied minds on this planet, right? So point number one, with the need for collectivity on this planet. And point number two is that you cannot understand everything which I told you now in this lecture. This would be impossible. And normally this entire argument I'm making over 7 lectures with a lot more time. But you need to know that this knowledge is accessible, right? So it's not, you don't have to face the world and think, oh my goodness, this is all completely impossible to understand. You have to have a sense that you have both the ability on the one hand and also the right on the other hand to know these things. And that enables you as citizens of this planet, right? It enables you to not only protest, but also to fine-tune, to make steps in the right direction, to withstand the lure of the all too easy explanations, and to become kind of enabled. I think that would be an important thing for me.
Good. Are you seeing the chat? There is...
Not a really dystopic question. The question is, do you believe that the world seen as one will continue to collaborate with future instability, or will we reach a tipping point such as every man for himself? Well, I mean, a lot of science fiction is exactly the every man for himself scenario, right? My belief it will be much more about islands of stability in an ocean of confusion. So, we are collective creatures, and collectively we will manage somehow. And I think, and then the question very much is to build good collectives, to enable them again with infrastructures like good cities, good neighborhoods, and to enable them also with good stories. In order to stabilize themselves. And this is very much what I see. This is very much why I am still an urbanist, is to generate good neighborhoods and good stories in order to generate stability over time, right? And so I don't think it will be every man for himself, but I think we need to be careful that it's not group against group. And for that, we need to generate, again, good infrastructures and good stories in order to generate enough inclusion and equality that we survive this future together. I think maybe that's the best answer I can give.
And I guess the challenges we are facing, we can only solve together, no? Alone, yes, we are not surviving. Yeah.
Hey, can you guys switch on at least some of the images, because I feel extremely...
So now everyone, everyone who's still there.
This is really brilliant.
Now we have to. Everyone can turn it on.
And I think what also would be really interesting for me to know, was it actually interesting and understandable, or this would be cool to know.
Yeah, I guess the question, some of the students, right? They asked the right questions.
Very interesting. Super. Thank you.
Yeah. Also, I think these were many questions from the students. Any question here from the others?
Does the Bjønness has a question?
Yeah, Hans.
You are extremely knowledgeable, and you had a fantastic, interesting lecture. We really enjoyed it. I'm wondering how you have worked on this. Have you worked transdisciplinary? Have you been a group of people together with different competencies working on this as an objective?
Very good question. I mean, this whole work started in my professorship at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, where I had to teach urbanism, and I had no idea what to teach. And then I slowly started to think and read and so on. But this is very much my own work and my own thoughts. This is 10 years of work. And aggregating, and then also finding kindred spirits, like discovering people like Harari. I mean, Harari for me was a shock, because all of a sudden there was a moment when the first part, this kind of early history was kind of conceptualized really clearly, and with this idea of religion, empire, money, this kind of connectedness became tangible. In a non-urban way, and it's just collecting things together.
I think the sociological position you have taken is very interesting. We have in our urban ecology studies by students from NTNU, we have discovered a lot of things regarding community in India and in Nepal. They have a Mohalla, there's a Muslim community, for example, in Shah Jahanabad in Delhi. You have in Patan in Kathmandu, you have the same size. There are 100 families, generally they are joint families, they're large families, normally 10 inhabitants in each family, 10 partners, and that makes 1,000 people. So you find the Mohalla or the toll in the Navari cities, they are based on communities of 1,000 people. Mm-hmm. So, of course, this is possibly a South Asian context, but also colleagues working in Xi'an in China and so on, in the Muslim city in Xi'an, have discovered similar things. Cool. I think your whole position of taking the human quality of togetherness as a starting point, I really appreciate. Mm-hmm. What I miss in your perspectives is working with urban ecology and working with development, context of development conservation in a developing country context, is that we deal with very large issues of poverty. We deal with also large issues of environmental degradation, and we deal with the realities of war. How can we address this in your context?
This is, you break my heart, because I think, I mean, let me give two answers. Answer number one is, I think this social group, or this collective making, right, is actually a really interesting topic. So Yamamoto thinks, Riken Yamamoto in Japan, he works with around 500 people as a unit, as a good unit for a neighborhood. The cooperatives in Zurich, they are very much trying to organize themselves into larger group than this 150 about, for two reasons. First of all, to generate a neighborhood, a truly differentiated neighborhood on the one hand, not just a tribe, quote unquote. And on the other hand, and that is truly interesting, they do it in order to have to formalize rules, right? So the argument is that, again, 150 people, you can improvise everything. So it kind of works, and the biggest gorilla wins, right? But as soon as you become bigger, you need to start to have rules. And a very clever man called Hans Wittmer, who is very much active in the cooperative movement in Zurich, he says, well, you need a big enough group, because only then you have objectivity. And only then can you have and enforce rules, which I find super interesting. This is this kind of one answer to this future. No, I don't think it will be every man for himself. I think it will be this 500 to 1,000 at a minimum, to hopefully still towns which functions, small cities which functions. Today I was in Winterthur, a really super interesting discussion with the city government about a tool which we are building. And Winterthur is interesting. It's 117,000 people, which means it's big enough to have a good administration, but small enough that administration still can talk to each other, right? Super interesting.
Yeah, Markus, You're frozen. We let the others, you're all there, right? Yeah. Okay, we wait if he comes back. But do you have, Markus?
Am I back?
Yeah, back, yeah.
Thank God. No, again, so this is the first part of the answer. So cities which are big enough to have a good administration, but small enough that the administration still talks to each other. Super interesting. This is one half of the answer. The other half of the answer, poverty, ecological degradation, political mayhem, the difficulty of foreign aid, which is an almost impossible thing to do well. To be honest, the reason why I'm not involved in these areas, because I don't know how to tackle it. That's why for me, this safe Arcadian paradise, I admit, called Switzerland, is for me a system and a model I can talk about with some authority. Right? Anything you are doing in India and so on, I have absolutely no authority, no knowledge of. I would love to be helpful, but I don't know how. And I admire people I really truly admire people who try to solve these situations, because it's just very difficult. I hope this was a decent enough answer.
Yeah, there are very difficult perspectives, so inequality, and we have an experience of trying to understand the homelessness situation with our students. And of course, you have people like Amartya Sen, who took the Nobel Prize in economics in '99. He's talking about people's entitlements. That means what rights have people to, for example, go to the money lender to get money so they can survive, so they can live. It's not a question of subordinating yourself, but it's a question of survival. And we have come to the stage now in many cities in the south where actually it's a question of survival. When you give a bag or a small bag with sugar to a person, I have experienced that in Tanzania once, and you expect him to share it with the family, but he sits down and he mixes it with water and he drinks it because it's the only chance in his life possibly to have the chance to drink sweet water.
I hear you, yeah.
So you have situations like this in the world now with tremendous inequality. And we have the luxury to think about our own environment and our own well-being. And of course, we all are like that, and we really are privileged to be in this situation. But the situation worldwide now has come to a point, like you are giving these very important circles of renewal and so on, which are extremely important to understand ecologically speaking. But the reality is different. There is no return. You come to the point where there is no return, like you are very importantly articulating that point. So I'm very glad for your lecture today, and it has been a brilliant lecture, and we hope we can repeat it for our students.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.